day. Welcome to the Indian Grain Storage Hub webinar series. The Indian Grain Storage Hub is a detailed report prepared by Pulse Australia for the Department of Agricultural, Fisheries and Forestry. Provides a number of practical initiatives for the Indian grain storage and handling industry to modernise and prosper. As a part of the report, a series of technical webinars have been developed across a number of speciality areas. These include grain storage, grain pest quality assurance and marketing, blockchain solutions, and practical on-the-ground initiatives to implement grain storage solutions in India. I'm Chris Orcott. I'm the Director of Ag Perspectives, and I've been the lead consultant on this project. Today's webinar is blockchain, an overview and application to the grains industry. We have the pleasure to welcome Emma Weston, who's the CEO and founder of AgriDigital. And AgriDigital is a digital supply chain platform introduced in 2017, bringing efficiency and transparency to global supply chain. Emma holds an MBA from the Australian Graduate School of Management, a law degree and a BA from the University of Melbourne, and as a former director of the Australian Government's Digital Skills Organisation, a member of the Australian National Farmers Federation Farm Data Code Working Group, and also been involved in Grain Trade Australia committees. Both Emma and AgriDigital have won numerous awards for their innovation and contribution to the ag tech sector. Emma was recently awarded the 2023 Percy Foundation New South Wales Entrepreneur of the Year. Emma farms with her family in New South Wales and is motivated personally and through AgriDigital to ensure global rural communities are sustainable and that agriculture is a valued choice to build a connection between consumers and the food industry. Welcome, Emma.
Thanks, Chris. That was quite long, wasn't it?
Well, it was, but yeah, you've got a very extensive resume, and I didn't want to cut it short today. So.
No, I appreciate that.
And I will say, Emma's one of the, I suppose, founders of kind of the digital blockchain solutions for the grain industry in Australia, and has been very involved in trying to modernise and develop our industry in Australia. So I think we're very lucky to have Emma today to really go through some basics around blockchain and what does it mean for the grain industry in Australia, but also we'll try and relate that back to India as well.
Yeah, excellent. I'm looking forward to it. And it will be very much in that overview flavour, Chris. But we can, if there's something that's interesting, we can try and dig in a bit deeper.
Absolutely. So.
Do you want me to just head off?
Yep, let's go.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks very much for having me again. I'm looking forward to sharing what we've done at AgriDigital, as well as what the broader grains industry has been investing in terms of blockchain and digital technologies over time. So let's jump straight in. For today, really, it is a very basic, what is blockchain? There's nothing wrong with getting back to basics, even though blockchain has been around for some time as an underlying technology. It is still something of a mystery to many people, and also not always well understood as how it can be applied in particular use cases or industries. Absolutely. So we're going to be looking at that as well, not just what it is, but how it can be applied, and obviously with a focus on the grains industry. We will take a little bit of a step back, Chris, and just have a look at what's the problem that we're trying to solve anyway by introducing this technology. What does it do for us as participants in the grain industry? And then I've really factored in on 3 high-level use cases for blockchain, which almost fit every type of problem set. So that's transaction and payment security, network and market efficiency, and provenance and supply chain assurance. So we'll be dealing with all of those as part of the use case section, which I've just put here as real world examples, because if it's not the real world, it doesn't really matter.
Yep.
And then also just rounding out with what does this mean when we're thinking about the future of commodities more generally, and also the evolution of digital trust, which is where blockchain fits in. So that's kind of an overview of what we'll be going through today. Just a little bit, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this in terms of who AgriDigital is, because there's a lot of information online. You can kind of go and find out more about AgriDigital. But I did want to share in terms of why I was so excited to be part of this webinar series. And that is really because at AgriDigital, We actually completed the world's first transaction on chain for the sale of grain, which was done in New South Wales between a farmer and a buyer. And there's a lot of information that we can provide if there is further follow-up, Chris, around this, around that particular pilot, and what went well and what didn't go so well. But it was actually a very simple transaction to do. And at the end of the day, it ended up with being able to confirm on a blockchain who owned what grain, where that grain was, how much it cost, and then actually to effect the payment for that grain. So that was what we did there. The company, although I'm presenting as AgriDigital, the company that runs that component of the blockchain solutions is called Giora, which is just why I've featured them on this screen. All right, let's jump straight into what is blockchain. I know there's a lot of words on the screen. At its simplest, blockchain is actually a very special type of database. That's at its most simple form. But what these words do is tell us why it's special. So it's special. It's a special type of database because, and let's take them through one at a time, it actually sets up a distributed or a ledger that is not just held in a centralized point, but can be held by multiple parties across a network of computers. So it's a digital ledger that is not centralized, so it's decentralized, but actually is able to record transactions in real time across every part of that ledger. So every computer, when one computer is updated in the network, the whole network gets updated. And that feature is what makes that database, one of the reasons that database is so special. The transactions themselves are time-stamped, and those different transactions, once they are added to or posted to the blockchain, are posted in blocks. They're linked in blocks, and that's where the term blockchain comes from. The transactions can only be added to this digital distributed ledger or added to the blockchain once they have actually been verified. That's really important. So there's a verification step, and that's really important because once they've been added to the blockchain, they can't be edited, removed, or otherwise added to or deleted. And that's the other really special feature of a blockchain. So it's this distributed ledger or database, but once things are added to that database, they are immutable. And so they become a permanent record of whatever that thing was that was added. And that really is what enhances the auditability, or what's put here at the end, the tamper-proof nature. And that's what gives us trust in what's on the chain. Yeah. So that's really what a blockchain is. But I might just stop there in case I haven't explained anything well enough, Chris.
No, I think so. Well, we're going to go through a bit of an example, aren't we, further through the presentation, Emma, to really show. But I think, it's a great definition of what blockchain is. But I think, for me, it's kind of, you've got this centralized hub where different people along the chain, whether it's a farmer, a storage agent, a transport operator, or to the final consumer, can see in real time really what's happening with the product or that certain piece of data, isn't it? So very That's different right. to where we've all operated in. I'll use a grain term, in silos in the past, haven't we, about our information, where this is just trying to link it together in a secure environment.
Yeah, exactly. And I've got a bit of an explanation or a bit of a flow of how that might work that might make it easier to imagine what that's like. So we might just skip on ahead. Yep. Before we do that, it's just taking this step back for a moment and thinking about what problem we're trying to solve with blockchain, because the other thing that I should have said earlier is blockchain tends to be an underlying technology. So it's not the technology that you are interfacing with on a day-to-day basis as a user. There tends to be an application up here, which is what we use as a user. That's what we might use as a farmer or a storage operator or a trader. But then it's the information from that application that gets filtered down to the blockchain. So yep. Probably just important to explain that as well.
No, that's a good point. So yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people think, well, how do I get onto the blockchain? And it's normally not. That's not really the way that we interact. But just thinking about, what are some of those problems? And I'm not going to read all of this out in detail. And I'm more than happy for these notes to be provided, Chris, to your audience afterwards. But yep. The problems that we're really looking at, they're pretty big problems that happen at scale. And this is where blockchain is can be very useful because it can operate at scale. Remember, it's that big network of a ledger, not, one centralized computer. So when we're thinking about food insecurity and looking at, trying to track waste in a food system, or thinking about fragile supply chains and, what is the role of an intermediary? What type of value should we place on that role of an intermediary if we can do direct transactions between a buyer and a seller, and we no longer require an intermediary in quite the same way? So there are things that a blockchain would facilitate. And I'll just take a little pause here and say that it's facilitated through something called a smart contract. So on top of the blockchain, there is code that gets enacted, and that code enables particular transactions to take place. And those transactions are normally found within what's called a smart contract. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Okay, that'd be good to go through that in a bit more detail. Yep.
Yeah. So supply chain consolidation, trust and transparency, I think that's one of the big ones that, everyone's really looking at here, is how can technology more generally, but blockchain specifically, engender trust in between participants. So the idea here is that, we've got Chris and Emma who know each other, so we don't necessarily need a blockchain to record our transactions or our payments between each other because we've already built up trust. But let's just say you or I were dealing with someone on the other side of the world, or on the other side of a contract, who we may not know or we may not have that relationship of trust with. What we want to be able to do is to codify what needs to happen in a transaction in a particular way, and that can't be changed. So, that codification might say, when you deliver a bag of grain to this particular location and it gets weighed on a scale, and the scale then would send effectively a signal to a payment mechanism, and you would then get paid. So that could be put into a smart contract, recorded on chain, to make sure that that payment had happened, and to be able to track that load of grain or that bag of grain. And that would all be done without having to establish a relationship of trust between the two parties, because it was actually sitting within the code itself.
Yeah. No, and I think that's the evolution of where, we're trying to get to in the industry here, and how we can then, apply some of that to the Indian market going forward. And I would say, and we've covered in some of the other webinars that we've had here, the reason the Australian system works, where we store grain, we have commingled grain, because there's a huge element of trust in the system. And a lot of that's due to Grain Trade Australia and their code of practice and our standards and all of those kind of things. But what we're looking at here is how can we move from, I suppose, the old system that we've had, where we've had systems and processes, to trying to digitize that. And as you say, then create an element of trust in counterparties that probably haven't had that years of experience in dealing with each other.
I think that's the key there. That last sentence that you said, Chris, is that, whichever jurisdiction we're talking about, usually if there is a smooth functioning supply chain, those transactions and that smooth functioning has built up over many, many years. Absolutely. And it could be decades. Yep. So, that engenders trust, and there are standards, whether or not they're written down, they've evolved standards within the industry. If you're looking at an industry that wants to evolve very quickly and to modernize very quickly, then it needs a technology base that accounts for the fact that that trust does not necessarily exist from a primary basis. And so the technology needs to come with the trust, or to enhance the trust relationship. I might just move on to the next slide, because I do want to make sure that we get into the use cases and the practical applications of blockchain. So those high-level use cases, again, that I referred to earlier: transaction and payment security, network and market efficiency, provenance and chain assurance. So let's see what that looks like in practice. Yep. So here's an example of a pretty simple supply chain. I've made it a grain supply chain. It could probably be replaced with other commodities as well. Very linear is the way that it looks. That's just the easiest way for us to present on screen. But farmer, buyer, packer, container terminal, shipping, processor, retailer, and consumer. So you've got your classic paddock to plate, if you like, supply chain here. So the farmer has some grain and they are going to want to sell that grain to a buyer. And the buyer has money to pay for that grain. Now, the fact that the buyer has money, we want to be able to record that somewhere, because generally what happens is the grower is going to have to deliver into a silo, and that grain is going to get commingled. And in order for the grower to have faith that they will be paid, they want to be able to see that there is the capacity for payment with the buyer.
Yep.
So if this was happening on chain, they would be able to inspect the blockchain to see that there was actually capacity to pay for their grain, which would give them confidence to leave their grain or to tip it into a silo, depending upon which mechanism to market was happening. So eventually the buyer would pay the farmer for that grain, and the transaction would be complete. And of course, the buyer would want a record that they had paid the farmer, so that there was no dispute at a later point in time. So that complete transaction, now that every component of the contract between the farmer and the buyer has been satisfied, could be entered on chain and posted with other relevant details such as quantity, quality, location, treatment, for example, if there was fumigation or other sorts of treatments that might be happening, or growing practices. If it was an organic grain transaction, for example, that growing practice might be added to the contract and could be recorded here. So that's obviously not the end of it. It might be the end of it for the farmer, but it's certainly not the end of it for the supply chain and for that particular parcel of grain.
Yep.
So next, that buyer is going to get that grain with other grain packed, ready to go to market. And once again, there is a component of assurance around the ability to pay that needs to be inspected and recorded. And there is a payment that is made from the packer, let's say, to the buyer if there was an intermediary buyer there. So let's just imagine that we're going buyer to buyer to buyer, just to kind of make it simple. That's not always the case, of course. The grain is going to get shipped, and I'm not going to go into each part in detail because there is a high degree of replication here. We've got a series of buy-sell contracts, but I think the important thing to note is that every point in the supply chain, there is additional value add and information that is being built into value add to the physical, but value add also to what we might call the digital twin of the physical grain. So we can imagine this physical grain going through the supply chain. It could be blended up, it could be packed, it gets put closer to port. All of that adds value to the grain. Yep. But there's also information, data that's been added to that original record from the farmer. There's now a wealth of other data that's been collated along the way. So the grain gets shipped. At the point that it gets shipped, the buyer's now being paid. So, what we could have here, for example, is let's just say that it is on a CIF basis, and so it's actually out at sea or at a particular point that would be nominated when there'd be a transfer of title from the original buyer to the next buyer. That could be geolocated, for example. So you could cross the equator, let's say, and at the equator you could say title transfers. That could be specified in the smart contract on the blockchain. That's important because, of course, the buyer no longer has risk for that grain anymore, and the risk in that grain, insurance coverage, etc., has now transferred to the new buyer. Now, all of that happens with a whole lot of manual processing and a lot of paperwork, as you know, Chris, from your background, in order to establish at any point in time who owns what grain and which risk lies where, and what is the value of that grain, and therefore when should payment be made, and if payment is made, how much. Yep. But all of that can actually be codified in advance, put into a smart contract and put onto the blockchain. And when particular components, so that would be the bottom line of what I'm presenting here, when there's particular ticks that are made, then there can be either a transfer of title, a transfer of money or payment, or in fact both. Goes to the processor, onto the retailer, and then eventually ends up with the consumer. Now, at the point of the consumer, just for the purposes of this exercise, let's just say the consumer is a educated consumer who wants to know something about where this grain came from and how it's been treated through the supply chain. The notion of the blockchain is that this information has been recorded at every single step, such that the consumer could go into some kind of application, for example, on their mobile phone. It could be scanning a QR code, which would then activate an information file or a story file, which would tell them all of the history that they wanted to know in respect of provenance, but it doesn't have to tell them necessarily things like every payment that was made. So you can actually choose subsets of information to make available to different participants on the supply chain. This means that you can still have trust and transparency without necessarily having a completely open market with a completely open data set, which would obviously make it very difficult for traders and others to participate if that was the case. So that's a pretty quick example of an end-to-end farmer through to consumer, paddock through to plate set of transactions which could happen on a blockchain, noting, you know, well, for the purposes of this webinar, we've just kind of hashed out, and that's actually what those blockchain records are called. They're often called hashes. So we've used that for a reason, but we've basically just hashed out the data there. And the important point there is that there's several ticks which basically say whenever a tick comes up, the next part of the transaction can take place. But if that failed for some reason, because let's just say when the grain got to the packing terminal, it was found to have weevils in it, or it had been fumigated with a particular chemical that was not able to be shipped to a particular market, then it would actually, that when that information was entered in on the contract, it would fail the specifications of the smart contract, and therefore shipping would not be able to proceed. And that would get pulled up a lot earlier as well, which is also one of the benefits. And that very nature of being able to get to that detail, I think, builds trust within that supply chain itself.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, for me, I suppose the interesting part of this, you know, a lot of the time we think of blockchain and, you know, basic understanding, it's around the money flow, you know, which is probably the bottom that we talk about. And that's what we're all very concerned around. But, you know, in grain supply chains, you know, quality, and as you put up the top there, that provenance piece is so important as well. So being able to manage that quality through the supply chain to ensure that you get paid in each of those points is very important. And that's something that we, you know, in, I suppose, our old analog kind of industry that we've been working on, those two factors have been very disjointed in the past, haven't they? So I think, you know, being able to put it all together in a system that provides you payment, but also a quality assurance is very powerful for the industry in the long run.
Exactly right. And so the power here is that you can have the same underlying protocol in terms of the data component of your supply chain with various applications that may sit on top of that to manage the quality aspects, to manage the most efficient payment aspects. So it doesn't mean that, I just want to assure this as well, it doesn't mean you need to get paid in crypto or in a blockchain issued currency. That may be the most efficient way of doing it. But actually, when we did the first sale of grain on a blockchain, whilst we did issue a payment in an agri-digital dollar, if you like, that agri-digital dollar was really just used as a proxy, and it was a 1-for-1 with an Australian dollar. So we were effectively a little bit ahead of our time, because there still is no digital Australian dollar right now. So it was really a stand-in for a digital Australian dollar. But then what happened was, once that payment had been made, it was an alert to the banking system to then make a payment in fiat currency. So then an actual Australian dollar in fiat currency payment was made. And that crypto component, which was just a stand-in for the Australian dollar, was I mean, it's not a very nice term, but it was killed essentially. So it's taken out of circulation. So it expires. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a farmer needs to receive, or a buyer or a packer or anyone else in the system, or a logistician or a truck company, whoever, does not need to receive payments in a cryptocurrency, unless that is the way that the buyer and the seller or the service provider have agreed for payment. So there's a number of different payment mechanisms on blockchain. So, one we've just gone into, which is just around really replicating what happens on bank rails and then sending a signal to the bank rails to make the fiat currency payment. You could have a cryptocurrency, and you can also have, there are countries now that have issued digital dollars. That's something that India has been investigating with its own central bank. One of many central banks around the world that has been experimenting, with a digital rupee or, digital form of currency. And you can also have something called a stable coin. So that is a crypto form of currency that replicates and is pegged one-to-one to an alternative fiat currency, for example, the US dollar, as a core trading currency. So there's a number of different ways that payments could in fact be made. There is actually quite a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can do with blockchain, bearing in mind that, as we went through with the definition, the underlying protocol or database is immutable, and therefore is very static. And that's, that its lack of flexibility is actually what makes it trusted.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a great point you're making about the flexibility, and I think that's, when people hear blockchain, they automatically think cryptocurrencies as well. But I think you've very well explained that that's just one piece, and it can fit into the existing banking systems, and offer, I suppose, a trusted system to try and transact money between different counterparties.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be used to affect payments at all, but it can be. So that's the important takeaway here. So jumping into another use case, which could be interesting, Chris, is around supply chain finance on chain. So, when looking at a supply chain like grain, although the farmer to first buyer transaction could well be a cash transaction, quite often from that first buyer forward, there is some form of finance that needs to come in to support the movement and management of that inventory, that grain, through the supply chain. Very rarely is there enough cash within the whole supply chain to get that load of grain from the farmer, to bread on the table or pasta on the table for the consumer without some use of debt somewhere. So one of the projects that we did earlier on was to work with, we did a proof of concept with Rabobank, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is the world's largest agricultural bank. And what we did was said, let's have a look at a transaction where there is a grower, a trader, and the bank. In this case, it was Rabobank. And the grower is going to sell grain to the trader, but in this case, the trader didn't have the ready cash to pay for the grower, and so they were going to borrow that money from the bank. So the bank was in fact effectively, what would happen now is, grower goes and sells the grain to the trader. The trader has a facility with the bank. They draw down that facility and then pay for the grain to the grower. At that point that payment is made, there is a title transfer to the trader. When it gets more complicated sometimes when banks are involved, because actually that title transfer goes to the bank, not to the trader, because it's actually the bank that is doing all of the funding behind the scenes. So what we were looking at here was taking that transaction, and instead of doing all of those different sequences of grower to trader, trader to bank, bank to trader, trader to grower, grower to bank, bank to grower, in terms of all the title transfers, the money transfers, and etc. We were looking at whether we could put that into those series of transfers and agreements into one smart contract that sat on the blockchain and get it all executed at the same time, which is what an atomic transaction is. the blockchain is really, really good at being able to do this. So it can take all of those sequential steps, which in a normal bank's case, and Rabo is no different to most banks out there, sometimes could take 6 weeks to complete the transaction.
Yep.
Could we get it done in less than a second? So all money transferred, title transferred, and all of the accounting entries pushed into the accounting systems of the different parties so that there was a full record. And that's exactly what we did. So, and all of the settlements, so all the payments in this case were done with a Rabo digital dollar. So Rabo actually created a digital currency in order to effect this transaction. And so, the benefits here was it was real-time payment on title transfer, so no counterparty risk for the seller. Obviously, massive amounts of efficiency in terms of reduced time and reduced cost.
Yes.
There was one version of the truth. So instead of having multiple data entries created by multiple parties, which then have to be reconciled before everybody can get paid and to make sure everybody's got what they need to have, you just have one version of the truth. And the other thing it does, because it speeds everything up and the money flows exactly where it needs to be, in a single transaction instead of a sequence of transaction, it actually improves liquidity across the supply chain because it's actually freeing that capital up a lot quicker than what is happening at the moment. So this was something we did back in 2017. And certainly banks have gone quite a long way in taking some of these structured inventory finance products and been able to do them in metals and other commodities, but also can be done in grain, as we proved here.
Yeah. Excellent.
So I might just wrap up and then we can just kind of riff on any other questions that you might have, Chris, or, go back and revisit any slides or dig into anything. But I just wanted to really end with that blockchain really sits as a tool in a toolkit. So when we're looking at supply chains, modern supply chains, future-proofing our supply chains in terms of the investment that we make, and introducing technology into supply chain as part of that, blockchain is part of the tool in the toolkit. It's not going to solve every single problem, and it shouldn't really be viewed as that way. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a really important part of the toolkit. And so, what it can do is work with a lot of outcomes that I've put here, a little bit as a building block. So what are the building blocks of digital trust, which is really what most of us are looking for in a modern supply chain. And some of those building blocks are, you need to have digital platforms that can be integrated to begin with, right? There isn't going to be one super application or one super platform that everyone uses. As much as we might like that at AgriDigital, we'd love that to be us, but that's not going to be the case. They need to be cloud-based. So, it needs to be, using the internet so that data can be shared. There needs to be a willingness to work with automated data and workflows, right? So if parties are uncomfortable with automation and need to be able to push a button at every single step and have gates at every single step, that is going to slow down the impact of technology enormously. And we're just not going to get the full feature benefit then. The other component is a readiness to look at real-time event-driven supply chain finance. So looking at what happens in a supply chain and looking at what all of the events are and how that relates to access to capital. I do think that connection with access to capital is really important for a modern supply chain, because we could bring all the best technologies in the world, the best methods, the best processes, share the best in practice knowledge, but we do need to be able to bring the capital and have the trust of the capital providers in the supply chain as well. That obviously can lead to real-time payments. The next kind of layer is actually being able to identify what is passing through the supply chain and who is acting in the supply chain. So the digital identity of people and things. It's not just a farmer having some sort of digital identity or a trader having a digital identity as a company, but also weighbridges need to have a digital identity when something or a scale needs to have a digital identity. And that's because when the weights or the quality assessment is made, we need to know which thing made that assessment and be able to track that. And it would be that would also be tracked on chain, on a blockchain. So you would know who the actors are. If a weighbridge had been used that wasn't certified, for example, you could actually stop the transaction. So the smart contract could require that all of the particularly quality and quantity instrumentation was registered and, for example, had an up-to-date inspection certificate so that it could be relied upon. One of the reasons we like digital is because you can do things with digital assets that you can't do with real world assets or just electronic assets. And one of the things that you can do is you can make them programmable. So the reason there's a lot of effort that's been put into digital dollars or digital rupee is because it's not just an exchange for fiat. You can actually, for example, close off certain markets. So if there were markets that were not able to be traded with, that one country did not want to trade with, they could make sure that a payment could not be put into that particular country.
Yep.
Digital title, so records of ownership, obviously crucial. That often needs to be recognised in a regulatory sense. So although we can do something from a technology basis, we actually do need at some point to interface with government and regulators to ensure that that is enshrined appropriately in the legislation or is able to be covered by the current legislation and regulation if it is technology neutral. But a lot of legislation is not technology neutral, and that's why, you know, I've got it there in particular. And then, of course, moving to digital currencies and provenance and traceability. These are all some of the building blocks that eventually get us to an environment of digital trust, which is where I think a modern supply chain needs to sit.
Yeah.
And so I'll just finish there.
No, that's good. It's a good gives us a good building block. So I suppose the question, yeah, as you know, we're trying to. This project was involved in developing, a more modern kind of storage system within the Indian market, and as you know, within India, numerous small farmers and probably a mandi based or a market based system. So so what advice would you give to the Indian market to start the evolution of this process? Because as you say, there's an element of trust that we need to develop. So what's kind of the best way for a market that to start developing and using this kind of blockchain solutions?
Yeah, look, I think it definitely is very difficult to do from one party forward. It really needs, if it doesn't have the backing of government, it needs some level of consortium approach. So it needs to bring a couple of key players together such that because it has such far-reaching consequences, we don't really want to use the trite example again, you and I don't need a blockchain in order to trade with each other because we can just make a phone call or we could, just send an email. But once you have this very large network, of farmers, such as exists in, India, I mean, even in Australia, it's large enough, but it's so much larger in India. And many of them are, located in difficult regional areas from a communications perspective. There needs to be some key aggregation points, and then those aggregation points really need to come together with a common approach, I believe, to developing standards for a modern supply chain and industry and looking at a common technology base at the very least. They could have different applications that they use depending upon their own needs, but looking at a very similar technology base. And then, of course, being able to establish relationship with financiers, and to be able to build the trust with financiers in the technology system that is being built out. Very, very important, because obviously none of this happens without money.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point. We often think of the blockchain through that, and the example you give around through the different trains, but it's around trying to then be able to finance and access money through some parts of that chain as well. And I think I'll make your comments around standards. There's another webinar that we've looked at about, and we did with Grain Trade Australia on just what we do here around our industry code of practice around standards and how we manage a lot of these things. So that's one of the important pieces of how our industry works, is that we have a common set of standards and processes that we work through as an industry, and then the next evolution of that is then how can you try and digitize some of that through blockchain technology?
Yeah, I think that's right. And then I think looking at having a reasonable timeline to work with, it does take time to not only just build these things out, but to actually take all of the players on a journey. So
Yep.
there is a level, and once again, we've had the benefit of this in Australia with GRDC, GTA, grain growers, grain producers, other, state-based farmer groups, etc. There's good models for this that exist, but there actually needs to be extension and reach out work. And so there needs to be some training, education and bringing along of the journey of the farmer groups, the trading groups, all of the industry groups, really can make this very successful and accelerate it if they get behind it.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Emma. I think you've provided a great overview of what AgriDigital's done in the blockchain space and how the industry's evolved and what we can do. And I think we're very fortunate to have you probably as a preeminent expert on this within the grain industry and the Australian agricultural industry around just how we can apply these solutions. And I think the exciting piece about the report that we've done in this webinar series is trying to work with the Indian farmers to try and develop and modernize some of their systems that they've got over there to ensure that their industry can grow and prosper as well. So I think, thank you, Emma. And Emma's details you can see, which is on the presentation here, which will circulate around to everyone. And no doubt, Emma, happy to be involved if people have some further questions around how we can use these blockchain solutions. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's such a pleasure to be part of it, Chris. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Emma.